There are moments in psychology when a discovery changes everything we thought we understood about the human mind. Carl Jung faced one of those moments when he began documenting a pattern so unsettling, it haunted him for the rest of his career. It wasn't a psychosis or a delusion, it was a transformation. A quiet, invisible shift that turned the gentlest souls into something else entirely. It began with patients who appeared harmless, soft-spoken, fragile, endlessly kind. Yet behind their politeness was something powerful waiting to awaken. Jung would later describe them as individuals on the brink of what he called psychological completeness, though at the time, he had no words for what he was witnessing. These were the empaths. They had spent their lives absorbing the emotions of others, the anger of parents, the disappointment of lovers, the unspoken tension in families held together by denial. They were the quiet ones who apologized too much, who blamed themselves for the chaos around them. And yet, Jung noticed something in their eyes that unsettled him. They were not broken. They were watching. In the Zurich clinic, patient after patient arrived with the same pattern. They carried bruises, emotional scars, and a tendency to rationalize abuse. But as Jung listened to their stories, he began to see an emerging structure, a kind of psychological architecture beneath the suffering. These individuals weren't merely victims, they were analysts of human behavior without realizing it. Their empathy wasn't weakness. It was data collection. They tracked microexpressions, tones of voice, inconsistencies in language. They remembered every slight, every lie, every manipulation, without consciously intending to. They were, in Jung's words, mirrors of the unconscious. When he asked them about their abusers, they could recount with uncanny precision the moments when deceit began, the triggers that caused rage, the emotional tactics used against them. It was as though their minds had been trained not through education, but through pain. And pain, Jung knew, is the greatest teacher of all. The deeper Jung investigated, the more he realized that these empaths were not passive observers of suffering, they were repositories of it. Each carried the psychic weight of others' unresolved trauma. Families unconsciously appointed them as emotional filters, soaking up the darkness no one else would confront. But something extraordinary and terrifying happened when this burden became too great. When betrayal arrived. It was always betrayal that cracked the facade. A partner's infidelity, a friend's deceit, a family member's manipulation. The empath, having endured years of quiet suffering, suddenly reached a breaking point. But it wasn't the kind of collapse Jung had seen in typical neuroses. No tears. No rage. Just silence. A profound, chilling calm that settled over them like fog before a storm. Jung described this moment as the clarity event, the instant when an empath's accumulated perception overrides their denial. They stop trying to see the good in others and begin to see the truth instead. In that silence, something ancient and powerful stirs, the shadow. The empath, once a vessel for everyone else's pain, begins to integrate the very aspects they were taught to suppress, their anger, their intuition, their authority. The transformation is immediate and irreversible. Jung wrote that, once the shadow is acknowledged, it ceases to operate in darkness. The awakened empath becomes frightening not because they are cruel, but because they see everything. They stop absorbing lies and start reflecting them back. And the world around them begins to tremble. Patients who once blamed themselves for everything began to articulate truths with surgical precision. They confronted abusers without emotion, not out of vengeance but with clarity. Jung noted that their demeanor changed, their voices even, eyes steady, movements deliberate. They no longer sought validation. They sought accuracy. Jung realized these transformations represented the psyche's most advanced defense mechanism, shadow integration through betrayal. The psyche, forced to protect its own integrity, stops absorbing pain and starts enforcing boundaries. The empath evolves from an absorber of emotion to a master of discernment. Jung's colleagues were skeptical until they saw it for themselves. He would bring these patients into controlled environments, exposing them to strangers with hidden traumas. Within minutes, the empaths could identify wounds, fears, and motivations with astonishing accuracy. They weren't guessing. They were perceiving. Jung's notes described them as diagnosticians of the soul. They didn't use intuition as mystics do, they used observation as scientists would, yet guided by something that transcended logic. Jung's pen would tremble as he wrote, "They are not prophets. They are witnesses to the unconscious in motion." He began to suspect that empathy, when fully developed, was not a sensitivity disorder, it was an evolved cognitive function. A hyper-awareness of emotional truth. But with awareness comes responsibility. And danger. Jung worried about what would happen if these individuals turned their insight toward control rather than understanding. Because once an empath integrates their shadow, they possess both compassion and precision, the ability to influence others without detection. They could manipulate as easily as they could heal. Yet, most didn't. Jung observed that those who completed integration chose peace, not power. They withdrew from toxic relationships quietly, dismantled manipulative systems without confrontation, and rebuilt their lives with methodical grace. He wrote, "They have become love with boundaries, an impossible paradox that only the awakened can embody." These were no longer fragile souls. They were psychological sovereigns. Months after their transformation, their lives began to shift in measurable ways. Abusive partners lost control of them. Families once dependent on their guilt collapsed under their own dysfunction. People who had once dominated them began to avoid them without knowing why. Jung called this phenomenon the predator's instinct reversal. Predators, he noted, can sense when prey is no longer prey. Manipulators feel it instinctively, the energy of someone who cannot be deceived. The integrated empath emits that energy, a quiet authority that unsettles the disingenuous. As Jung wrote, the awakened need not defend themselves. Their presence alone is revelation. But Jung's fascination went deeper than observation. In private, he admitted he recognized parts of himself in these patients. Jung had always been attuned to unseen emotional realities. He too had wrestled with his shadow, navigated the descent into the unconscious, and returned transformed. The empaths, he realized, were living proof of his own theories, shadow integration not as an abstract concept but as a lived human evolution. He began to see their journey as the next phase of psychological development. Humanity's potential to become conscious of consciousness itself. Jung's later writings referenced these individuals as integrated empaths. People who had reconciled feeling and thought, intuition and logic, vulnerability and strength. They could perceive deception but were no longer entangled by it. They had transcended the victim archetype entirely. The transformation, he noted, followed a pattern, stage 1, recognition. The empath identifies the shadow, the repressed anger, intelligence, and power they've long disowned. Stage 2, integration. They merge those disowned aspects into a unified sense of self, allowing empathy and discernment to coexist. Stage 3, application. They use their perception not to absorb pain but to navigate it consciously. At this stage, Jung wrote, they are no longer mirrors to others. They become architects of their own reality. He noticed something even more remarkable. These integrated empaths didn't isolate themselves. They naturally began helping others, guiding them through emotional chaos, teaching discernment through example. Jung described this as the return to service, the final act of individuation. Their presence alone catalyzed transformation in others. Families began to heal when these empaths stopped enabling dysfunction. Communities grew stronger when they modeled emotional boundaries. Even workplaces changed when they stopped apologizing for their clarity. They didn't preach. They simply existed differently. And that difference was contagious. Yet Jung's private journals revealed a darker contemplation. If such transformations could occur naturally, what would happen if someone learned to trigger them deliberately? Could trauma be used as a catalyst for forced evolution? The question frightened him. He scattered his notes across multiple volumes, never publishing them in full. He feared misuse, by systems that might exploit the awakened for manipulation or control. Jung understood the dual nature of all power. What heals can also destroy. He called it the ethical threshold of awakening. Only those with self-awareness could cross it safely. By the end of his life, Jung's reflections on these empathic transformations had evolved into something almost prophetic. He wrote that these individuals represented a glimpse of humanity's next psychological stage, beings capable of complete emotional awareness without being consumed by it. They could feel everything, yet choose what to act upon. They could see through deception, yet remain compassionate. They had become, as Jung phrased it, love armed with discernment. Modern research now confirms what Jung sensed decades ago: individuals who integrate trauma consciously, who stop denying their perceptions, develop extraordinary emotional intelligence. They become resistant to manipulation, immune to gaslighting, and almost impossible to control psychologically. The world calls it intuition. Jung called it sovereignty of the psyche. And that's why his notes described these awakenings not as breakdowns, but breakthroughs. Every empath, Jung believed, faces a choice: to remain a sponge for collective pain, or to awaken into conscious perception. The catalyst is always pain, often betrayal. The difference lies in what comes after. Some collapse. Others rise. Those who rise don't harden, they clarify. They stop mistaking compassion for self-abandonment. They become love with discernment, kindness with spine, softness with awareness. These are the ones Jung called the awakened. If you've ever been told you're too sensitive, too aware, too much, remember Jung's insight: sensitivity is not fragility. It's precision. It means you are perceiving truth others cannot yet bear to see. So if you've reached the moment where silence feels stronger than argument, where your calm unsettles those who once controlled you, where you see through everything without speaking, perhaps you are not breaking down. Perhaps you are awakening. Because Jung's most haunting discovery still echoes through psychology today, the empath's journey is not from feeling too much to feeling less. It is from unconscious absorption to conscious choice. And that choice, between suppression and integration, decides everything. If you've learned to trust your own perceptions, write it in the comments: I see clearly now. Because once you see, you cannot unsee. And as Jung taught us, the moment you begin to honor your own perception is the moment you stop being a victim of others' projections. That is where awakening begins. If this resonated with you, don't just watch, reflect. Jung believed knowledge unintegrated is just another shadow. Let this be the beginning of your own awakening. Comment your moment of clarity below, and share this with someone who still doubts their own perception. Because the world doesn't need more broken empaths. It needs more awakened ones. And as Jung discovered, awakening is inevitable. The only question is whether you will guide it consciously, or let the world force it upon you.